And we're back with more of the Quran's incredible miracles. This time, the Quran apparently predicted the discovery of the Big Bang. It's funny how despite all these verses supposedly matching so well to modern science, they never inspired a single person to put forth any of the scientific theories NoClash claims they so clearly refer to. But oh well, I guess taking credit in hindsight is good enough for someone deep enough in the religion. And speaking of credit, I want to extend a huge thank you to King Crocoduck for taking time out of his busy schedule to help me out with some of the physics details here. If there are any mistakes here, don't blame him, they're probably my fault. And it's quite possible that I made some mistakes in some of the crazier physics concepts here, because I'm kind of a noob. But if I did, they're honest mistakes at least. I really tried to get everything right. I'm pretty sure I did a lot better than NoClash, but I'll leave it up to the experts whether I managed to exceed that low bar. I'll leave a comment below so if people have corrections to add, they can leave them in one correction thread. In case you're not familiar with King Crocoduck, he has a great channel here on YouTube that you should check out right now. Well, actually, not right now. Finish watching me first and then check it out. You'll find links to his channel in the card and in the description. Try his Quantum Theory Made Easy videos, or Is Science a Social Construct? Or, especially close to my heart for obvious reasons, his hugely entertaining debates against Kent Hovind.
Hi.
Hi again. Funny how we keep bumping into each other.
Have you ever wondered how this universe that we all call home came to be?
Or if it came to be at all. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, not obsessively, it's kind of irrelevant to my life, but if we could somehow find out the answer someday to the fundamental nature of reality and the universe and the origins of it, if origins are even a meaningful concept when applied to something like that, then yeah, I'd be interested, I guess, sure.
Lots of theories about the origins of our universe have come and gone, until one theory in particular came along that physicists and cosmologists could agree on. They agreed on it, of course, because there is scientific evidence to support it, and you may have heard of it. It's called the Big Bang Theory.
That's a popular misconception, but an understandable one given how often it's misrepresented in popular science articles. The Big Bang Theory doesn't actually address the origin of the universe, at least not in the sense of why there's a universe instead of why there's not. It addresses the evolution of the universe, not how it came to be in the first place. If you're familiar with my Kent Hovind debunks, think of it as similar to how evolution by natural selection addresses how life changes over time, but not how life came to be in the first place. So I guess you could say it's a theory of the origin of the universe as we know it now, but not of the universe overall because it doesn't address why anything banged.
The founders of this theory are two scientists from the 1920s, Georges Lemaitre and Alexander Friedman. They both used Einstein's theory of relativity to prove that the universe is in a constant state of expansion.
Another nitpicky point, they didn't prove it, they theorized it, but it wasn't confirmed observationally until a little bit later. And no, this video won't be all nitpicks, bear with me.
Then in 1929, the American astronomer Edwin Hubble confirmed this theory again.
Not again, for the first time.
After observing evidence that virtually all clusters of galaxies appear to be moving away from all other clusters, which also indicates that the entire universe is expanding. Physicists agree that the theory is sound because the universe is in fact still expanding even now.
So basically you're saying physicists think the theory is sound because the theory is sound. Somehow I think you might be missing a bit of the reasoning.
If you open the Quran and read through all the verses that speak about the origin of the universe, you will find that it confirms what physicists have been saying about the same topic. For example, in chapter 51, verse 47, it says, "And it is we, God, who have built the heaven with our creative power."
Sounds like you fucked up the line in the original script and had to fix it, but Claire wasn't available for reshoots, so you just had to call her in on Skype, eh? I get it, I sometimes have those obviously re-recorded lines too, where the recording has a different tone for whatever reason. And there's nothing wrong with that when you're an amateur hack like me who took 5 years to figure out why audio clipping is bad. But when you're a professional production company like Ultra Production and the production is obviously well funded, it's a little surprising.
And verily it is we, God, who is steadily expanding it.
I addressed this verse in another recent video about Quranic miracles, so I'll only touch on it briefly here. So first, while it does seem to be a plausible translation that God expanded or expands the heavens, that's not the only one. As you can see here, there are a lot of translations made by Muslims and non-Muslims alike that are pretty different. That God is the maker of things ample, that God is very powerful. But we'll take it for granted that the intention really was specifically to state that God expanded or currently is expanding the heavens. And in that case, we should note that the next verse says that God spread out the earth, which is inaccurate, but which goes some way towards confirming the Quran's biblical influence, specifically from Isaiah 40 and 42, which say that God stretched out the heavens like a curtain and stretched out the earth, respectively, which puts the lie to any interpretation that reads a deep scientific insight into the incredibly vague word expand in this passage.
What we know about the universe is that space was created first and gave birth to particles, galaxies, stars, the Earth, and you and me. In several places, the Quran also addresses the order in which various things were created in a manner consistent with what science has discovered. For example, in chapter 18, verse 51, it says, "I, God, did not make them witness to the creation of the heavens and the earth, or to the creation of themselves."
How does that address the order of creation? If you read the verses right before it and right after it, it's very clear that this is saying that God created Iblis, Satan, and his offspring, and that there's no way he would have taken them as assistants, and so people shouldn't treat them as protectors or as partners with God. There's no way to read that as having the slightest relation to the origin of particles or galaxies unless you're deliberately ignoring the entire context and completely ignoring the actual words of the verse. Talk about reading your own narrative into the scripture, I mean, damn. But you are NoClash. If I didn't expect this by now, I'd be fooling myself. But if you hit me on the head with a brick enough times that I actually started to accept your reading of it as particles, galaxies, and so on not being witness to the creation of the heavens and the earth, it still wouldn't make any sense because particles, galaxies, and stars all predate the Earth, which means if they could witness anything, they would have witnessed the creation of the Earth. But of course, they can't witness anything because, of course, particles, galaxies, and stars are not alive. I suppose it's possible that I'm really just misunderstanding your meaning because you suck at conveying it, and all you actually mean is that humans didn't witness the creation of the heavens or the Earth, in which case, no shit, humans had to originate after the Earth if they originated on it. It's not exactly an insightful comment in that case. So no matter how generously I try to interpret your nonsense here, it remains total nonsense.
The universe expanded from very high density and exploded in gravitational waves. The same gravitational waves from those colliding black holes in space that pass through the Earth, causing the universe to stretch and expand over and over again.
Another pickup recording made with a tin can. Why did the director accept this?
In chapter 41 of the Quran, verse 10, it says, "In 4 days he made in the earth what anchors from high above it."
Yet another interesting translation you've chosen. At least this time it's not without precedent, but it's certainly atypical, given that almost every translation into English prefers the word mountains. Now I have to admit, sometimes it's really hard to figure out the literal translation of some of these classical Arabic words, but it seems that the literal meaning may be something at least close to anchors or anchorages or stabilizers, judging from the translations that use it. The Gali translation is the best example, explicitly saying anchorages, i.e. mountains. So I'm okay with accepting the word anchors even if it is a little bit unusual, but what I'm not okay with though is pretending that this is most likely a reference to anything other than mountains. So the word we're talking about is rawasiya, and let's get some context on how that word is used elsewhere in the Quran, which might give us a hint as to what it means here. So verses 31:10, 16:15, and 21:31 all have the mountains, or anchors if you like, placed in the earth, and they all use the word fi, which means in or on. Verses 77:27, 50 verse 7, 13 verse 3, and 15:19 also say the anchors are placed in the earth, although instead of fi, they choose to use the word fiha. 31:10 and 16:15 both use the word alka, which means cast down. So God cast down the mountains into the earth. From where? Well, if NoClash's translation is correct, then from above. That is, from heaven where God is at. 16:15 specifies that God cast down anchors, rivers, and roads, or at least paths. Now, rivers and roads are terrestrial things on the surface of the earth, and when you consider that 21:31 specifies that God made passes through the anchors so that people can find their way, it starts to be pretty hard to see this as referring to anything but something terrestrial that people pass through, like mountains. This interpretation is further helped by 77:27's use of the word shamichatin, which means lofty, a word that applies pretty well to mountains, but incredibly poorly to what you're gonna tell us it applies to, NoClash, which I'm not gonna spoil just yet. And finally, 21:31, 31:10, and 16:15 also say that God put mountains in the earth lest it should shake. The word used in those verses for shake is exactly the same word tamida, as is used in this hadith. The Prophet said, when Allah created the earth, it started shaking. So he created the mountains and said to them, upon it. So it began to settle. Now, you might think the word for mountains there is the same word we've been discussing, but it's actually not. The word for mountains there is al-jibala, which means the mountains and only the mountains. So it's clearly referring to mountains, but the story is the same as in the Quran where it uses the word anchors. God put something, specifically mountains, on the earth to prevent it from shaking. I don't know how much more clear this could possibly be.
And put barakah in it.
Finish him. Baraka wins. Babality.
And equally measured out sustenance of its dwellers for those who ask.
No, what it actually says is that God created the mountains, blessed the earth, and determined its nourishments all in 4 days. I like how you straight up left the 4 days part out. And in the previous verse, it also says God created the earth in 2 days. Now, I know you have an apologetic for that in your cosmic calendar video, a really terrible, stupid apologetic that I'm sure my audience would love, so we'll probably get to that. But not today.
Let's break down the meaning of this verse. When God says he made in the earth what anchors from above it, he's referring to the gravitational waves that are coming back from those colliding black holes in space that act as gravitational anchors to anchor the earth and anchor things to the earth.
I'm sorry, what? I must have misheard that. Please say it again.
He's referring to the gravitational waves that are coming back from those colliding black holes in space that act as gravitational anchors to anchor the earth and anchor things to the earth.
No, I didn't mishear it. So, the writers at NoClash apparently think that what anchors things to the earth is not Earth's own gravity, but gravitational waves generated by colliding black holes somewhere off in space high above the Earth. Okay, wow, no. Really no. Those gravitational waves you mentioned from the merging black holes have such an extremely minuscule effect that only incredibly sensitive and very expensive equipment can detect them at all.
Start with a meter and divide it by 1,000,000 3 times over. The first time you divide it, you get a micron, so 10 to the minus 6. That's sort of the size of a cell, or maybe the thousandth of your hair. Well, you've got much more to go. Then you divide by another 1,000,000, and now you're at 10 to the minus 12. That's about 1/100th the size of an atom. And you're still not there. And now you divide again by another 1,000,000, and you get to this number that we have to measure.
In fact, as you just heard, gravitational waves do next to nothing. And what they do does not involve pushing objects to the Earth, pushing the Earth toward the sun, or pulling the Earth toward the black holes that generated them. All they actually do is distort space-time a tiny little bit, making the Earth jiggle ever so slightly. Here's an animation released by the LIGO Lab showing the effects in an incredibly exaggerated form. Now, I cannot possibly emphasize any more strongly just how exaggerated that animation is. It's just to get the point across. So no, these gravitational waves do not anchor objects to the Earth. That's the Earth's own gravity. You also say these gravitational waves anchor the Earth itself, in addition to anchoring things to it. So what does that even mean? That they anchor the Earth in place? Like, what, around the sun? Well, that's the sun's gravity, again, not gravitational waves, and I'm not sure how you could possibly consider the Earth anchored in place, even speaking as colloquially as possible, considering the immense distance that it moves each year in its orbit around the sun. And by the way, if the Quran does indeed mean to refer to gravitational waves, what exactly does it mean by the passes that God built through them? And how could you sensibly say that these anchors have been placed on the Earth when they're just propagating through space, only affecting the Earth for a fraction of a second as they propagate through the universe at the speed of light? And if these were what was meant by anchors, then what was meant by rivers? What was meant by roads? Did they refer to something in space too? What does any of this mean, NoClash? How do you even think it means anything?
Then God says he put barakah in it. Barakah is a word that people commonly use for blessings, but it actually has a deeper meaning. It means to grow and increase in volume above and beyond expectations.
Yeah, and it's commonly translated as blessing, one sense of which is a fairly accurate translation. As you say, it's really about how those blessings cause some sort of increase. So, for example, when that verse says that God gave barakah to the earth, given the context of the part that follows right afterwards, saying that he determined its nourishments, or as you prefer, measured out its sustenance, it would mean that his blessing caused the earth to flourish with food for life. We can see a little more clearly what's meant when we look at other verses about God casting anchors, or mountains, down on the earth, because some of them follow the same form as this verse, but with more plain descriptions.
Emphasizing that the Earth started out small, but constantly grew larger and larger.
No. That does not say or even slightly imply, much less emphasize, that the Earth grew in size by gravitational accretion or otherwise. Not unless you're desperately searching for a way to force the Quran to fit your preconceived narrative and refusing to accept its actual narrative. And by the way, it took a hell of a lot more than 2 days for the Earth to form. I've really got to take a look at your weak-ass apologetics for that one of these days. I'm kind of doing these videos in a weird order. I hadn't exactly planned on starting to address your entire catalog of videos. Although maybe I should. Well, one thing at a time.
A strange type of matter caused the expansion of the universe in its early stages. This matter behaved very differently from the matter that we're familiar with today, because instead of attracting other matter, it repels it. This has led physicists to call it antimatter.
Before I get into whether antimatter actually does repel matter, by which you presumably mean gravitationally, I have to take a second to touch on this claim that antimatter is actually called antimatter because it repels normal matter. Now, surprisingly, in one sense, it's not far off the truth, not because the modern conception of antimatter has anything at all to do with gravitational repulsion, but because in 1898, a letter by Arthur Schuster was published in Nature using the term antimatter to describe a form of matter that would gravitationally repel other matter. Now, he wasn't suggesting that this type of matter really existed, but instead, he was just suggesting the possibility of its existence. Random tangent though, can we just take a moment to appreciate the other letter on this page? Live frog taken out of a snake. Your correspondent, Colonel Major, may be interested to hear of another instance of a batrachian returning alive from the stomach of a snake. A grass snake of about 24 inches, kept in captivity, had not fed for 3 weeks. It was then given a very large specimen of the common frog, full grown. This was swallowed at once in the usual way by taking the hind leg first. In about an hour and a half, the frog was a third of the way down the snake's body. Then, on the snake being played with and handled, after some minutes the lump began to move up rapidly toward the head of the snake, the mouth opened and out slid the frog. Rather off color and not very happy looking, but quite able to hop about in a shuffling fashion, though decidedly shaky on his legs. To an amphibian, imprisonment without air could not be very hurtful for a few hours, were it not for the poison of the gastric juices. When the grass snake was left again with the frog, it re-swallowed its prey. 19th century, you had all the best sciencing. Anyway, back to antimatter. So antimatter by the modern conception was not suggested until 1928 in this paper by Paul Dirac, which, as you'd expect, refers to opposite charge, not to gravitational repulsion. Now, Dirac didn't use the term antimatter here, but it started being used a little bit later to describe what he described, particles with opposite or anti-charges compared to normal matter. And this is the foundation of the modern usage of the term. So the fact that the word had been used in 1898 to describe something else isn't really relevant. Now, onto where you're getting your idea that antimatter does in fact have a repulsive interaction with matter and may therefore be behind the expansion of the universe. I'm guessing you probably read an article like this one from phys.org about Massimo Vellata's assertion that general relativity predicts anti-gravity interactions between matter and antimatter, and that this could be involved in causing the accelerating expansion of the universe. The article's written as though Vellata's idea is true, when in fact it's an undemonstrated hypothesis, and it's definitely not the consensus position of physicists. I've included in the sources a link to another paper pointing out some of the problems with Vellata's paper and the heavy impact that would have on general relativity. As the quote from Vellata in the phys.org article says, "Anti-gravity has always been controversial, and likely it will be so until we can get an experimental or observational response. However, I hope that my work in the meantime can at least dissipate some prejudices against anti-gravity." Well, that's fine, dissipate all the prejudices you want. The evidence still isn't there, and most physicists disagree with this idea. But if there's any experimental evidence to be found, it may be coming soon. The Aegis, G-bar, and Alpha experiments at CERN will test the effects of gravity on antimatter, and 2 of those experiments are already up and running as of the time of this video. So the short version of all of that is, NoClash asserts that antimatter does repel matter, and it does have something to do with expansion, but neither of these claims is actually supported by the evidence or accepted by most physicists. And yet they find it wise to tie the accuracy of the Quran to the truth of these claims by the end of the video, which means that they're basically betting the foundation of their entire religion on a theoretically unlikely outcome of those antimatter experiments at CERN. Well, good luck I guess, guys, but you might have hitched your wagon to the wrong horse here. Doesn't bother me, of course. I'll find it hilarious if those experiments come back and totally annihilate everything you've just claimed, and the Quran along with it.
Sounds to me like antisocial matter.
I hope they're paying you well to embarrass yourself with jokes that bad.
Antimatter actually disobeys energy and momentum conservation.
No, it doesn't. I'm guessing that when you say energy conservation is violated, you mean matter-antimatter annihilation somehow violates the conservation of energy. But that's not the case. All the energy is conserved, it's just distributed among the product particles, photons and other particles. Momentum is also conserved. The momentum of the particles, just like the energy, is distributed among the product particles once again.
It disobeys symmetric charge conjugation and parity.
By symmetric charge conjugation, I assume you mean C-symmetry, which means that when you switch the charge of all the particles in an interaction from positive to negative and negative to positive, so that you have those particles antiparticles instead, the physics will continue to work the same way that they did before. And when you say symmetric parity, I assume you're referring to p-symmetry, which means that when you switch the sign of a spatial coordinate, similar to when an image is flipped in a mirror, then the physics will also work the same way they did before. Now, I need to start off here by taking note of a fundamental error in your argument, which is that if one of these symmetries is violated between matter and antimatter, for example, if switching the charges of all the particles leads to some different outcome, then this does not mean that antimatter disobeys something or that antimatter is asymmetric. If there's some violation of C-symmetry or P-symmetry between a setup of matter particles and an identical setup of antimatter particles, then both the matter and the antimatter are exactly identically disobedient, if you really want to use such an inaccurate word, because asymmetries don't exist in either one of them, but between both of them. There's no correct, obedient physical outcome, there are just different outcomes. And the only difference in this case is between two outcomes that are asymmetric with each other, not between each individual outcome and some objectively correct divine standard of physical outcomes, defined as whatever happens with particles having charges consistent with normally observed matter, as if matter is somehow more inherently right than antimatter. And that means that right off the bat, the entire conceptual basis for your claim is nonsense, because it assumes that any operation involving matter gives an inherently correct or obedient result, whereas one involving antimatter, at least in scenarios where the results break charge conjugation or parity symmetry, gives an inherently incorrect or disobedient result. Of course, conveniently, antimatter doesn't suddenly get redefined as obedient thanks to the zillions of scenarios where no symmetry is broken at all. Nope, despite that, it stays disobedient in your opinion, which seems a little convenient. Now, I said antimatter can save symmetry, and here's an example. So, when parity violation was first observed in 1956, the experiment only involved matter. Atoms of cobalt-60 were aligned so that their spins were all in the same direction. And the basic idea is that for p-symmetry to hold, when beta particles were emitted by these atoms, there should have been no preference as to which direction they were emitted relative to the spin, so that if the system were reversed in a mirror, it would be mathematically indistinguishable. But this is not what was found. The emissions were largely in only one direction, and that meant that parity symmetry on its own was being violated. Violated by two different configurations of matter, so I guess matter's disobedient to itself. And how did they fix this problem? Well, antimatter saved the day, because they realized that if both the parity and the charge are switched, that is, if the flipped version of the experiment is done with antimatter instead of matter, then symmetry holds up just fine. It's just that now the symmetry that's being preserved is a combination of charge conjugation and parity symmetry called CP symmetry. So despite antimatter actually being required to preserve symmetry, and not being some sort of destroyer of symmetry or disobeyer of symmetry, you still call it disobedient because supposedly it disobeys symmetry. That is some terrible slander. I think you owe antimatter an apology. So, long story short, antimatter does not violate CP symmetry. I'm guessing where you actually got this idea is that you probably read some article about how CP violations have been put forth as possibly having played a role in causing the current imbalance of antimatter and matter in the universe, but you didn't read very carefully and you mistakenly thought that that was referring to something antimatter does. But without you more clearly stating what you mean or where you heard it, I can only guess.
And it disobeys our current one-directional time arrow.
Okay, so let's continue the symmetry story. CP violation was thought to be impossible for a while until it was first observed in 1964 in neutral kaon decay, as described in the paper by James Cronin and Val Fitch that went on to win the 1980 Nobel Prize in Physics. To try to make it comprehensible, the basic idea is that for CP symmetry to hold, the decay products expected from a CP positive kaon should be CP positive, and those from a CP negative kaon should be CP negative. But a few CP negative kaons decayed into CP positive products. The details of the products don't really matter, that gets the point across well enough. Other CP violations have since been observed in B mesons, but the violation is slightly different. A strange B meson can either decay into a positive kaon and a negative pion, or a negative kaon and a positive pion, but the decay rates are slightly different between these two outcomes, even though for CP symmetry to hold, they should be the same. Now note that it's utterly irrelevant here which product particle is the antiparticle, because the relevant point is the CP asymmetry of the process, not the charges of the end products of the experiment. And also note that none of this says anything at all about the nature of antimatter. If anything, it says something about the nature of the weak interaction, which is what enables the CP violation in all known cases. Now, all of this might sound irrelevant to what you just said about the arrow of time, but the point is that I think what you're talking about is time symmetry violation, T violation, considering that you were just talking about C and P violation right before it. And after exceptions to CP symmetry were observed, time symmetry, T-symmetry, was rolled in. T-symmetry means that if you reverse the arrow of time, the physics will work the same as before. And I can only assume that's what you mean is being violated when you say antimatter disobeys our current one-directional time arrow. But what I don't think you've understood is that breaking T-symmetry doesn't actually mean that anything is moving backwards through time. It just means that if you could observe the system functioning in reverse, or equivalently if you use negative time in the math, then all the same stuff would happen in the system, except of course in reverse. So say you watch a movie all the way through and then you rewind it at the same speed. Everything will be in reverse, but scenes shouldn't change in length just because you're going backwards. So an example is the paper that I linked in the description about T-symmetry, which is covered in an easier to understand form in the blog post I linked by Sean Carroll. When the oscillation back and forth between two different states of a B meson is measured, it takes longer for an operation to occur than for the exact opposite of that operation. So if you chart the positive time and negative time versions of the process on two separate charts where the time arrow is drawn in the same direction, those charts won't look identical. This has absolutely nothing to do with the direction time is actually moving or what direction any of the particles are actually traveling through time. So the observation of T-symmetry violation was fully expected. There's no more problem with T-symmetry breaking any more than with P or C or CP symmetry breaking. In fact, if CP symmetry can break, then T-symmetry must be breakable for the overall CPT symmetry to hold. And CPT symmetry is what's important. That is the only symmetry I've mentioned that is still considered a universally unbreakable law. There's currently no process known to violate this symmetry, and if one were found, it would shake modern physics to the core. CPT symmetry holds just as well for antimatter as for anything else.
And disobeys causality.
I honestly have no idea what you mean by this. Causality affects antimatter to whatever extent you might say it affects matter. If we stick to the large scale, then time is dictated by the direction in which entropy increases, which is the same for both matter and antimatter. So if you have a clumsy antimatter person who drops an antimatter egg on their antimatter floor, it's gonna fall and go splat, and it's not gonna unsplat. I'm guessing you mean something like that when you say causality, but who can really say for sure, eh? I think this must be just another side effect of your misinterpretation of the statement that antiparticles are just particles moving backwards through time. You think that somehow implies that causes would follow effects. But once again, this comes down to the arrow of time, which doesn't mean much when we're talking about quantum mechanical processes. If you're gonna talk about the arrow of time, you should apply it to the large scale, because that's where classical entropy starts to mean something. And since entropy is the foundation of how the arrow of time is defined, that's not just some minor point, it's critical. Anyway, audience, I know I haven't reached the actual point NoClash is trying to make with any of this, but trust me when I say they do have one, and it's shockingly stupid. And I'm gonna get to it very soon, but I really need to split this video because it's just way too much. Don't worry though, I already have the second half written, and it's in production, so you'll see it soon. I hope you're enjoying it so far, and if so, consider supporting me on Patreon like all the wonderful people on this screen. I couldn't do any of this without them. Thanks for watching everyone, and I hope to see you for the epic conclusion in part 2.